Welcome to Africa Today TV. I'm Tara Wall. For the first time under President Obama, the White House is hosting a highly anticipated U.S.-Africa Leader Summit in Washington, D.C. this week. The summit comes amidst questions, though, from some African leaders who wonder whether it might be a little too late. Joining me to discuss this groundbreaking event and more is an authoritative voice on U.S.-Africa relations, Ambassador to Senegal and former Assistant Secretary for African Affairs under President George H.W. Bush, Herman Cohen. Ambassador Cohen, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Well, before we actually get to the summit, can you tell us a little bit about your previous roles in previous administrations, the importance of U.S.-Africa relations, and the state of those relations as you see it today?
Well, I'm in the generation that started out with Africa becoming independent. I was a junior diplomat in the 1960s, and all these countries were becoming independent. So I said, this is going to be great. Let me get into that game. And I volunteered to serve in Africa, and I served in 5 countries, ending up as ambassador to Senegal, and I enjoyed it all. And it was interesting to see how they were evolving toward eliminating poverty, toward development, toward building up their economies, and how they were evolving politically. And of course, it's not been smooth sailing.
Sure. Well, yeah, and if you contrast from when you started, the relations then between, I guess, the relations and the development over time now, how have you seen that progressed?
Well, one thing that was very important back in the 1950s, President Eisenhower was the first president to deal with African policy, because all these countries were becoming independent when he was president. And he said, we're not going to bring the Cold War to Africa. And that was a great decision because, you know, we were in the midst of this war with Russia, the Soviet Union, and we could have said, you're either with us or with the Soviet Union. But he said, no, let them be neutral. Let them decide they're independent. We're not going to try to capture them or what have you. So from that point on, relations have been very smooth. We always honored their sovereignty, whether they were small countries or large countries. We send ambassadors to every country. President Kennedy started the Peace Corps that was extremely popular in Africa. We sent teachers to East Africa, I remember at the beginning. And then we had the great Kenya airlift in the 1960s, and guess who was on that? President Obama's father. And he was sent to the University of Hawaii, where he met President Obama's mother. So our activities were always abundant, and our relations with Africa, I could say, never had any low points. It was always very smooth, very friendly, because the Africans understood that we were not trying to make them pro-American or try to put them in our orbit. And so I think President Obama is standing on the shoulders of other great policymakers.
Well, when we talk about President Obama and the summit this week, in fact, the president said ahead of the U.S.-Africa Leader Summit, he wants to, quote, launch a new chapter in U.S.-Africa relations. So apparently that would indicate that it hasn't always been smooth, but what do you think he means by that or meant by that?
I think what he's meaning is that our policies have been good, because we've helped a lot of people, like President Bush Jr. He had the PEPFAR program for HIV, a tremendously good program. President Clinton had the African Growth and Opportunity Act, created lots of jobs in Africa, people making apparel for Walmart and for a lot of big retail stores. But basically what he's saying is, we've done more charity work and not enough development work. We got to help the Africans really grow faster, like South Korea, Malaysia. They really went ahead fast. So he's saying now, and you'll see this in the summit, is we want more private investment.
Sure. And
not enough Americans are going there. Sure, we have oil companies, lots of them, because they go where the oil is. Or we have mining companies in Congo, for example, they're mining for copper.
But not enough economic development.
Not enough factories, not enough agricultural, agro-industry, and that type of thing.
Do you believe in the sincerity when he talks about the public-private projects? A lot of folks are saying, going into this, that there's a lot of talk about what needs to be done, what needs to happen. It's great that it's happening, but what's going to come out of it. And he did just announce these 4 regional leadership centers on the continent.
Right.
Is that a viable first step in your view?
Yeah, well, that's the side of the helping the next generation. He wants to concentrate a little bit on the youth leaders. There are 500 of them in Washington now that are meeting with him, I believe. And what he wants to do is make sure that the youth of Africa just don't go into law and that sort of thing. He wants more doctors. He wants more entrepreneurs. So he's setting up these 4 youth centers. I think it's a great idea. But he also wants, at this summit meeting, Africans to meet American business people.
Right.
And he wants them to attract investments. And on the margins of this thing, I'm helping the Senegalese get a deal with an American power company, which will be announced. They'll be building a new power plant.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Well,
that's what your work you're currently doing now.
That's right. I'm a consultant, and I'm working with a New York company called Contour Global. Okay. They invest in power plants. They don't sell power plants. They invest, and then they sell electricity for, say, 25-year contracts. And we're in 5 African countries, and we just are about to sign a deal at the summit to build a 100-megawatt plant in Dakar, in Senegal. And believe me, they need it. You know, they have 5-6 hours a day without power. So I'm very excited about that.
And is this going to translate to jobs not just for Africans and for Americans as well?
Yes.
Well, primarily the focus is getting Africans up to speed and bringing economic development and growth to that continent, to that region.
Well, you're not going to get anything without power.
Sure.
You can't run a factory without electricity, or you can't run any sort of production facility without electricity. So it's going to help them. But it helps Americans too, because we build the power plants. General Electric, General Technologies, they build power plants and we export them. And where the US government comes in is they help financially. For example, the one we put up in Togo got 70% financing from the OPIC, Office of Private Investment, of the U.S. government. That's an extremely good assistance for this type of program.
And in the region, now I also read though, when it comes to chambers of commerce, for example, that business centers there generally right now, there were only 4 U.S. chambers in the entire continent. There were 4 more to be slated at least at some point for completion this year in 2014. Does that seem adequate enough for you to address these issues, or is that something that's just a part of the overall development and growth that needs to happen over time and starts small and gets bigger?
Well, chambers of commerce are organized when U.S. companies are there. You see, because I was the U.S. ambassador in Senegal a few years ago. And we had a U.S. Senegalese Chamber of Commerce because we had IBM, we had all sorts of U.S. companies there. So they got together. Well, I was the one who brought them together, and they said, "Hey, let's make a Chamber of Commerce here." And they all loved the idea, you see. But if you don't have U.S. companies, you're not going to get chambers of commerce. And most African countries now do not have U.S. companies. That's what Obama wants. He wants them to be there.
Well, about 50 African leaders were invited by President Obama. There were a handful that were essentially excluded. Why, in your opinion, though, do you think that it took so long for the U.S. to actually start this continent because we've been doing business with China, Brazil, Japan, France, among others. Why did it take so long, in your view, to actually have a U.S.-Africa summit? And why now, at this point in his administration?
Right. Well, I think there's a little bit of jealousy going on here. You know, the British and the French have been doing it for decades. The Japanese have been doing one every 5 years in Tokyo. It's called Tokyo International Conference for Africa Development. But lately, China did it for the first time. And I think there's a little bit of jealousy because China is so much bigger in Africa in terms of business than we are. So I think somebody said, hey, we're not going to let the Chinese get ahead of us. But also, historically, the U.S. doesn't go for summit conferences. I'm sure President Obama has seen at least 25 African leaders one-on-one.
Well, he said well, a couple of things. The summit will only last 2 days, which Do you think? I mean, do you think it's enough to cover everything that needs to be covered? Number one, and number two, there was a little concern that he wasn't meeting one-on-one with any of these leaders. He said he'd have a general discussion, and that doesn't generally follow with protocol to not meet one-on-one with these leaders.
That's
Is
right.
that a snub in your view?
It's not a snub. It's, it's a question. If he was going to meet one-on-one with 47 leaders, that takes quite a lot of time out of his schedule. Although I noticed that the president of China, he did what they call speed dating, 15 minutes. But President Obama doesn't want to do that. He likes to have a good conversation. And the Africans that he's met one-on-one over his 2 terms, he spent an hour and a half with them, had lunch with them. So he doesn't like 15 minutes. But I think he could have met maybe with groups, maybe.
Smaller groups.
Smaller groups, that would have been better.
And will 2 days suffice for what you think needs to be covered, should be covered? Will it cover it all? Is it adequate enough?
I think it'll be a beginning. He's really revamping American policy. He's saying foreign aid as we've known it is not really the best. It's been good, but not the best. What I want now is investments, not just Americans, but I want you Africans to develop an entrepreneurial class and invest your own money. The World Bank says that there's $100 billion of African money that's sitting outside.
Wow.
That's unacceptable. They should be investing it at home. So he's saying, Americans, you partner up with Africans, bring that money back, and we'll create jobs.
And I mentioned earlier that about 54 of the countries total are invited, but less than 50, I think, are participating. There were a handful that were excluded, among them Zimbabwe. Do you think there's a reason, or what reason do you have, or do you think President Obama didn't invite President Mugabe of Zimbabwe?
Well, Mugabe has been kind of a pariah. Ever since, I'd say, the last 10 years. He's done some pretty awful things. He's confiscated farmland from commercial farmers without paying them compensation, and he's been very rough on human rights. So I guess there would have been an outcry if he had come to the United States. I personally, as a former diplomat, I believe in talking to everybody. I would have invited everyone.
Yeah, and some say that change has, I mean, it's shifted a bit. I think that was the position early on by the administration, was that it wasn't going to entertain some folks, and now it's because of the summit, and there's signs that there's a bit of a shift here. Do you see that in strategy anyway with how to deal with African leaders? Well,
I think it's a bad thing to boycott anybody. I believe even if you're going to just tell them, look, we think you're...
Well, Sudan is another one, and that's been, they've been deemed, state-sanctioned terrorists, essentially.
Well, the president of Sudan is under indictment by the International Criminal Court, so we would have to arrest him, you see, if he came here. So that's impossible. Mugabe I would have invited, but there's another one in Eritrea who is a really cantankerous person, and he and the United States don't get along. He refused to take an American ambassador, for example. But I would have invited him anyway. Look, let's talk it out. What are your problems?
In line with that, and in line with some of the leaders that have, I guess, raised concerns with some folks and maybe not with others, the main themes of the summit overall tend towards security, trade, human rights, things of those nature. Education, though, seems to be missing. Do you think that's important, that should be included in the summit? I know there's a youth focus this week, but for the summit itself, the importance of education.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of important things. You have to set priorities. But education has gotten lots of attention in Africa over the years. We've put a lot of money into education, as have the Europeans. So I don't think this is necessarily something that we'd want to talk about now, because it's something that is in process. We're doing it. What President Obama wants to do, and I agree with him, is let's get some new things in there that'll really make Africa move. And there are 2 things. One is electric power, because, as I said before, you can't do anything without it.
Sure.
And the other thing is extremely important is agriculture, because the majority of Africans live in the rural areas, and they are very primitive in how they produce food. So there has to be investments in roads to the markets, in storage facilities, in fertilizer, and in technology, tractors and that sort of thing.
And I guess at that point, too, is when you can start talking more robustly about trade as well.
Right.
And trading back and forth with
When I started out in Africa in the early days, they were a powerhouse in agriculture. They produced more corn, more palm oil, more pineapples than anybody in the world.
And what happened in your view?
Well, they discovered oil, and all of a sudden everyone flocked to the cities, and they gave up. So most people in rural areas, I remember visiting the president of Tanzania, and he said, "You taught us how to produce cotton, and we had a bumper crop. But it's rotting on the farms because we don't have roads to take them to the ports," and that sort of thing.
Well, do you think, in your assessment, that this will become, the U.S.-Africa Summit will be something that's institutionalized, should be a regular occurrence, and where would you go from here in that end?
I think it's a good idea, although I think they have to make sure that the president does one-on-ones. Frankly, I was working directly for President Reagan. I was in the White House with him, and I was Assistant Secretary of State for Bush Sr., and they received these African leaders one-on-one. They came to Washington, they had lunch, and then they had a nice discussion. I'd like to see more of that, you see. But having a summit meeting, say, as symbolic that we love Africa, let's do it once every 5 years like the Japanese. I think that would be a good idea.
Well, also some would say that the U.S. seems that obsessed with China's growing influence in Africa. We talked a little bit about that earlier, and that, you know, there's maybe this jealousy or this competition. But what does America offer Africa, would you say, that would counter China's appeal to the continent?
Well, I haven't heard a single American official tell me that China is hurting U.S. interests. Nobody has said that. They say, well, they're building roads, they're building dams, that's great. You know, why should we be worried about China? And they're trading, they're buying African goods. In fact, there's a growing middle class now in Africa, people who have money to spend beside for food, that comes from investments in mining and in oil that the Chinese are doing. So there's nothing wrong with the Chinese. What I'm telling the Africans, you've got to manage the Chinese, because they're taking advantage of you. For example, they bring their own workers. Why should they bring their own workers? There are plenty of African workers. And when they do hire Africans, they don't treat them right. I was teaching over at Johns Hopkins, and one of my students went to Africa to study the Chinese. And she asked the Chinese managers, why are you treating these African workers so poorly? And he said, we're treating them just like we treat our own workers in China. So the Africans have to manage them. And also, they're bringing in a lot of people who do retail. There's no reason to allow them to come in. But that's not our problem. That's the Africans' problem, you see. But they're not hurting U.S. interests.
Yeah, well, someone said, and some have also argued, there's a sense that in Africa, China buys natural resources, builds infrastructures, offers seemingly cheap loans, but doesn't interfere with the domestic affairs of Africa. But on the flip end, you know, it puts the U.S. at a disadvantage because it's perceived sometimes as being too intrusive in lecturing African countries on human rights and democracy. Do you see that dichotomy there?
Not really. I don't think we do too much lecturing.
No?
No, we do it in really egregious cases, you know, like Mugabe. A few others, like Sudan, but one of the best professors I've ever had on Africa, he says, you know, when we deal with Africa, if your economics are good, you get a waiver on democracy. So countries like Rwanda, which are very authoritarian, totalitarian, their economy is excellent, so we treat them nicely.
Well, but some would say, I mean, I've heard this argument that you know, it felt like, you know, President Obama at times would, you know, when African leaders would speak up or speak out, or he would tend toward lecturing Africans as opposed to lecturing Europeans or other countries. Have you heard that, at least heard that argument? And if so, how do you generally respond when you hear that?
I haven't seen that he's lecturing them, but I have the feeling that he's unhappy with them because too many of them are using state resources to enrich themselves or to enrich their families. And he's itching to lecture them, I think, but he shows it in his body language and that sort of thing. He really says, you know, you and I have the same blood. I come from an African father. And you shouldn't be doing this.
Do you think he'll be well received if he has more of a listening ear as opposed to a lecturing ear during the summit? Do you think that you know, obviously folks don't want to be put off as they come in and they hear from the president. Do you think it will be more of a conversational approach as opposed to a combative approach?
I have heard from people who are close to the organization of this that this is what he's going to do. He's going to say, talk to me and tell me how you're doing, and also not just in economic, but tell me how you're doing on human rights. How are you doing on good governance? But he's not going to lecture them. He's going to listen to them. But of course, with so many of them, they're going to have to keep their interventions short, you know, like 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay. So until recently, the U.S. also seems to have opted to outsource its influence in Africa to former European colonial powers, particularly in France, the UK. And so can henceforth those European powers contain emerging market countries like China, Russia, into okay, I'm going to redo that. I don't like that question. I don't like that one. Let's scroll up to... Okay, let's do this one. Okay. AFRICOM, U.S.'s military command for Africa, which is based in Stuttgart, Germany, tried to establish itself in Africa, but African countries resisted hosting the military command. What, in your view, motivated African nations not to host AFRICOM on their soil?
Well, this goes back to the beginning of African independence. I remember reading the archives. President Eisenhower said, we will not have NATO forces in Africa. If there is instability, if there is civil war, let the UN do it, you know, with African troops. We don't want to be imperialistic and have American troops. So you won't find, the only country that has bases in Africa from Europe is France. And they've had very close relations with their former colonies. And these former colonies have wanted the French to be there. And when I was ambassador in Senegal, I remember visiting the army base there, the Senegalese army, and there I saw Frenchmen in Senegalese uniforms. So they're very close relations. But the others should not be coming in. They should not have what European forces or American forces in Africa. It's too imperialistic.
Well, so, okay. Well, there is some insecurity that's grown in the Sahara region of Africa, specifically in Libya, Algeria, Mali, and Niger since the demise of Colonel Gaddafi. Sectarian violence has now reached Kenya and Central African Republic. Do you think that the West opened a Pandora's box, in your view, in Africa by removing Gaddafi?
They had to take care of Gaddafi because there was an Arab Spring starting up in eastern Libya, and he had African mercenary soldiers. He didn't trust his own people to have an army, so he brought in Africans from Mali and Niger, and he was sending them to the eastern part of Libya to really kill everyone. He said, I'm going to kill everyone. I don't accept this Arab Spring in your demonstration. So we had to stop him from doing that, which NATO did, the Americans, the British, the French. But they had to follow up, which they didn't do. Gaddafi was gone. Okay, thanks, we're happy. Follow up, secure the arms depots. Make sure that that city of Tripoli is stabilized. We just let it go. You see, now arms are flowing from Gaddafi's arms depots down into the Sahel, down into Mali, down into Niger, and this is a very dangerous situation.
And what, in your view, how do we go forward in addressing some of these security issues, concerns? I know, as I mentioned earlier, that this is among the topics for the summit. And in your view, what are some next steps to help?
Well, the Africans need training and they need material, and I think AFRICOM is supplying that. AFRICOM is not going to send U.S. troops to fight. Right. They cannot do that, but they are training. And they have special forces in various countries. We do have some people in Chad in order to help Nigeria against this terrorist group Boko Haram, but it's very modest. The thing to do is train and arm the Africans so that they can handle this problem by themselves. What
is your view about what happened in Boko Haram and how that's been handled overall?
It's a long story, but it starts with Nigerian corruption. There's a lot of corruption in the army and in the political levels of Nigeria. And in these northern provinces of Nigeria, which are all Muslims, they treated some of these young people badly. And the people who were doing this were Western-educated Nigerians, people who had been to university. They became governors, they became high officials in these various states up in northern Nigeria. And they exploited these young people, and these young people got angry. We've worked for you, and you're not paying us, you're not giving us education. So they started an organization about 10 years ago called Western Education is Bad, because these Western-educated Nigerians were exploiting Nigerian young people who never had education. And the Nigerians treated them very badly. Human rights violations took place. So these people were radicalized, and it started building and building until you got into something very radical, extremely radical, called Boko Haram, and they're having a hard time dealing with it.
Well, just to, I just want to shift from that a little bit, because I do, one thing I think when we talk about the U.S. summit, the U.S.-Africa summit, turning back to somewhat of the business climate, the growth, the economic empowerment, what in your view would you say is a takeaway that Americans should take away about their view, their vision of Africa, and what needs to happen for this summit? What are your kind of recommendations, and how your dealings have been there, kind of another bigger, broader picture, if you will, of Africa in general?
Well, first of all, we have to have a mindset change. Our mindset has always been Africa is a charity case, humanitarian aid, that's what they deserve. But my experience in Africa, I lived there 12 years, is Africans are as capable of doing economic growth and development as any other people, just given the right incentives and the right assistance. So therefore, if we can help the African leaders create an environment where Africans can invest some of their money, bring it back from abroad, and feel safe doing that, where they can enforce contracts, the Africans will move ahead on their own, really. The farmers are terrific. And
there are areas that are thriving, that are prospering, that people do well, that businesses are, doing well.
Even Nigeria, with all its corruption, there's some wonderful private sector people, but I'm really hoping the farmers get a break.
Sure.
They work hard, the women as well as the men, and if they can get some infrastructure and some technical assistance, how was the U.S. agriculture built up? We had the farm assistance from the U.S. government, people spreading out all over the United States. Look, this is the seeds you need. This is the fertilizer you need. The African farmer will just burst out with wealth.
Well, finally, let me ask, Ambassador, in hindsight, what would you say would be your greatest achievement and your deepest regret as the premier of a U.S. diplomat for Africa?
Well, when I was Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, I spent most of my time in conflict resolution. And solving some of these wars was such tremendous satisfaction for me. Ethiopian War, the Mozambique War, just going down there and having all these heads of state signing peace treaties, things that I and my team helped bring about.
Oh, sure.
It was really a great sense of satisfaction. Disappointments, well, some of these deals that I worked out broke down later. For example, the Angolan peace treaty that we did in May of 1991, 3 years later broke down and they went back to war. And I was heartbroken because we worked so hard to bring that about.
Well, and you're still doing a lot of work in the region for U.S.-Africa relations today, correct?
Yes. Well,
You've got your project that's being announced. Anything else you can give us real quick?
Well, I'm working on oil exploration in Guinea, Conakry, and we have hopes of discovering oil there.
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. Well, we certainly appreciate you stopping in today and sharing. I mean, you're just so well decorated, and I wish you lots of luck for the future and going forward in this U.S. summit.
It was a pleasure for me.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time we have for today, and I would once again like to thank my guest, Ambassador Herman Cohen, for his insight and his depth concerning African affairs and the much-awaited, anticipated U.S.-Africa summit. Until next time, I'm Tara Wall for Africa Today TV.